On the morning of May 10th, 1875, federal agents moved at the same hour in St. Louis, Milwaukee, and Chicago. They walked into distilleries and revenue offices and seized the ledgers before anyone could burn them. By nightfall, more than 300 men were in custody. The thing they had been protecting was simple and enormous. For years, whiskey had been leaving these warehouses with the government's tax stamp on it, and the government had never been paid in full. The barrels were real. The stamps were real. The money was gone. What the agents had just broken open would end with an indictment one door away from the President of the United States. To understand the theft, you have to understand the number. By law, every gallon of distilled spirits owed the federal treasury 70 cents in tax. That tax was the single largest source of internal revenue the young post-war government had. The scheme was almost elegant in its plainness. Distillers would pay the revenue officials roughly 35 cents a gallon, off the books, and in return the whiskey was stamped as if the full tax had been paid. Half the money reached Washington. The other half was split among the distillers, the agents, and the men who kept the silence. Multiply that across thousands of barrels a week, and the loss ran to an estimated $1.5 million a year. At the center of it stood John McDonald. He was a former general and a Grant loyalist, and in 1869, the new president had appointed him supervisor of internal revenue for the Missouri district. It was a position of trust over exactly the money that was now disappearing. McDonald did not merely look away. By the accounts that later emerged, he organized the ring, set the rates, and collected. He was generous with the proceeds, funding party operations, and keeping powerful friends comfortable. For a time, the arrangement looked untouchable, because the men who would normally investigate were the men being paid. The money did not stay in Missouri. To survive, a fraud this large needed cover in the capital, and it found it. Revenue agents like John Joyce moved between the distilleries in Washington, carrying cash and carrying messages. The ring's reach into the administration is what would later turn an ordinary corruption case into a national crisis. For now, though, the books balance beautifully on paper. Whiskey recorded at low proof. Stamps reused. Spirits labeled as vinegar. Every trick pointed the same direction, away from the 70-cent tax that the Treasury was quietly being cheated of. The man who broke it was not supposed to. In June 1874, Ulysses S. Grant appointed Benjamin Helm Bristow as Secretary of the Treasury. Bristow was a Kentucky lawyer, a former Union officer, and, by reputation, genuinely incorruptible. He had served as the nation's first Solicitor General. When rumors of the whiskey losses reached him, he did not announce an investigation, because an announcement would have warned the very men he needed to catch. Instead, he worked in secret, and he worked outside the normal revenue service, knowing that the service itself was compromised. Bristow's method was patient and quiet. With his solicitor, Bluford Wilson, he recruited outside investigators and trusted informants in the affected cities. One key figure was a newspaperman, George Fishback of the St. Louis Democrat, who helped place a private agent inside the trade to track the barrels and compare them against the tax records. Slowly, the gap became undeniable. The whiskey leaving the warehouses simply did not match the taxes coming in. Bristow assembled the evidence the way a prosecutor would, building toward a single coordinated strike rather than a scattering of warnings. When the raids came on May 10th, 1875, they confirmed everything. The seized records exposed the daily arithmetic of the theft. In the weeks that followed, the count became staggering. In all, 238 people were indicted across the ring cities. The prosecutions began that October at Jefferson City, Missouri. John McDonald himself was tried by the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Missouri, David P. Dyer. McDonald was convicted, fined $5,000, and sentenced to 18 months in prison. The kingpin was down, but the evidence kept pointing higher. To run the courtroom fight, Grant appointed a special prosecutor, John B. Henderson, a former United States Senator from Missouri. It was, in effect, one of the earliest uses of an independent prosecutor in American history. Henderson followed the evidence wherever it led, and it led somewhere dangerous. Cryptic telegrams surfaced, and the trail ran to Orville E. Babcock, Grant's private secretary, the man who sat just outside the president's office and handled his most personal affairs. The fraud in the distilleries of St. Louis had reached the inner room of the White House. When the evidence first touched his own household, Grant said the right thing. "Let no guilty man escape if it can be avoided," he declared, endorsing the grand jury's work. But conviction and loyalty pulled in opposite directions. As the case closed around Babcock, the president's mood turned. In December 1875, Henderson argued in court that Babcock had worked to obstruct the investigation. Grant, taking it as an attack on his own integrity, dismissed his special prosecutor and replaced him with James Broadhead. The independent investigation he had launched was now being managed by the man it threatened to embarrass. Babcock's trial opened in February 1876 and ran for 18 days. Then the president did something no sitting president had done. On February 12, 1876, in the White House, Grant gave a sworn deposition defending his secretary's innocence. His words were read to the jury. Against the testimony of a president, the prosecution's case faltered. On February 25th, Babcock was acquitted, the only major figure to walk free. He never returned to his old post beside Grant, but he never went to prison either. The man closest to the corruption had been the hardest to convict. When the dust settled, the numbers told a hard story. Of the 238 people indicted, 110 were convicted, and more than $3 million in stolen tax revenue was recovered for the Treasury. Bristow had done what almost no one believed possible, and it cost him. Increasingly isolated in an administration that resented the exposure, he resigned in June 1876. The reformer who caught the thieves was pushed out, while the president spent his remaining credibility defending the men around him. On his last full day in office, in March 1877, Grant pardoned John McDonald. The whiskey ring became a lesson the country kept relearning. It showed how a fraud could hide inside the ordinary machinery of government, protected by the very officials paid to police it. It showed that an honest man at the top, Bristow, could break it open, and that political loyalty at the very top could blunt the result. And it gave America an early model of the independent prosecutor, a figure brought in precisely because the usual watchman could not be trusted. The barrels are long gone. The question they raised has never quite left. Who guards the money when the guards are in on it?